Thanks to our Patreon members for helping to make this episode possible, and we're now available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find more information at the links below. Good evening, and welcome to Primates Discover Writing. Now, this is a great one. I think this one, I've been fascinated by the origins and development of writing for decades, and so this was fun for me to go back through my notes, do more research, see what's been updated, which is basically nothing, and find out, where we are and what's happening. So this is kind of in two parts. This is sort of like what happened, the archaeological record of the development of writing, and then what it means, and how that has affected us and continues to affect us today. And let me just say that there's no part of this that isn't debated, right? Like it's one of these big questions. And so let's jump right in here. But again, this is all everything I say is there's arguments to be made, and it's complex, and there's just not a lot of agreement on all of this. But I think that the core of it is pretty well understood, though. So, step one, what comes before writing? So the speech, of course, has now been around for nobody knows how long. There are some people that argue that the Upper Paleolithic Revolution is brought about by some change, perhaps genetic change, perhaps cultural change, that really leads to an explosion in speech, that this is in language processing, that this is what has caused the seeming sudden in the archaeological record development of art and expansion of tools, and all of these things may be associated with a sudden development in speech. And it's just hard to know, right? It's a hard thing to prove in any direction. But so speech has been around for a very long time, quite clearly. And of course, our primate ancestors vocalized. And there's a type of grain gathering primate that lives, I believe, in the upper sort of mountainous areas of Kenya. And I should have looked this up. I apologize, but I believe that in the Kenyan highlands, and they're grain eating. They gather grass, and they sit in groups, and they live communally, and they gather the grain, and you can hear them. You can look up recordings of them, and it sounds just like a cafeteria. I mean, the vocalization that they're doing just sounds like people sitting in a cafeteria chatting. Yeah, it's amazing. It's like, wow, there we are, eating our grains out in a field, and maybe nothing has changed at all in all these years. So there is this question of speech and vocalizations and how that's come down to us. And then there is the idea of, okay, at some point we started writing down and recording what it was we were speaking. This is very controversial, because it turns out that that's not what early writing was doing. That was later writing. And so, how the relationship between writing and speech, that seems to us like, it's so natural. It's not natural at all. In fact, when people say, write it the way you speak it, like, absolutely do not write the way you speak. This is not how writing works. It's one of these strange ideas that we have because we've been an oral culture for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years, but we've been a written culture for a very relatively short period of time, given the archaeological record. So what is going on here? So the earliest sort of markings that we have, and by the way, cave paintings, cave markings, all this symbolic use predates the development of writing, which makes sense. But so the art symbolic, transformation slowly over time. When that happened, how that happened, what was preserved, what's been lost. Again, in tropical cultures, if you're writing on things that are much more likely to rot, and so how widely distributed, it's hard to know. But what we do know is in Mesopotamia, they began using symbolic clay figurines functionally that recorded, basically they were transactions. They were bookkeeping for the state, and they were like grain and donations to temples, which kind of was like a savings plan, because you had communal storage, but then how do you let people take out what they've put in? These kinds of things. And they did this for several thousands of years. This begins about let's say 8,000 years ago, maybe a little earlier, maybe even 10,000 years ago. Not coincidentally unrelated to the development of agriculture, right? Because when you move to these longer time frames, as I mentioned last time, you need like calendars and you need record keeping of some kind, because it's like now we're storing stuff. How much have we stored? How much have we drawn out? How much did you put in? How much did he put in? How much did she donate, right? All that sort of gets complicated very quickly, particularly when you get agriculture and cities, lots of people living together. We start tracking this. And it's very clear in the cuneiform record in Mesopotamia. And again, this may be simply an archaeological function because, baked clay lasts in the desert. It doesn't last in the tropics, or it doesn't last on the seashore when the tides come up. So, the fact that we know this from Mesopotamia is an archaeological artifact. It may have been more widespread other places, but this is the one that we know clearly. So, they started using these little figurines that said, if you put in a bushel of wheat, we give you a little pyramid, let's just say a pyramid of clay. And so that means 1 bushel. And so then later you can come back with your pyramids of clay and turn them in and get the bushels out, or however this works. And so this went on for a few thousand years, actually. So this was widespread. And then at some point they realized that, we got to protect the figurines. So they would wrap them because I'm going to store grain for 3 years, but my figurine kind of devolved. So they started wrapping the figurines in little clay balls, boules, I believe they're actually called. And then they realized we need to know what's inside of the clay ball. And so they started marking the outside with what was on the inside. And then they made the leap, it seems, from there to go, we don't actually need the figurine. We just need the mark. And that evolution seemed to take the big leap about 5,000 years ago. So say 3000 BCE. And they started using cuneiform tablets to inscribe receipts of basically kinds of bookkeepings, record keeping, and all these sort of things. And then slowly, that evolved into what we would call literary language. So they're writing speech, they're writing language, they're writing announcements from the Lord, and all this. But a couple of important notes here is, one is it was the priestly class that knew how to do this. And so you develop a special class of people associated with the temples, which were associated with the harvest, which is all tied together, who can read and write. And of course, this is a very powerful position to have because, one, you're not working in the fields. Very good. We're in a society that 95% of the population is working in the fields, and you're sitting in the shade reading cuneiform tablets. You're like, woohoo, it's good to be a scribe. There actually we have scribal practice writings that say it's good to be a scribe over and over again because it's like, hey, this is great. We're inside, they're outside, life's good. But this also gave them a great amount of power. And one of the things that happens after a few hundred years of this, and has happened repeatedly in history, is when you have a literate bureaucracy, which is functionally what the priesthood was, and an illiterate aristocracy, the putative rulers, the rulers realize really quickly, we need some of our own literate people who aren't the priests. Because the priests are doing their thing, we're doing our thing. And so then you get this notion of literate rulers, or at least literate either relatives or employees or appointees of the ruling class. So often, this could be slaves or servants in the royal household that were specifically there. Sometimes even eunuchs were specifically there because they were literate. So literacy was very difficult at this time, extraordinarily rare, and conferred a great deal of power. And so there's all these negotiations going on. And so that seems to be this process of record keeping to royal pronouncements to actual literary language that we can track pretty clearly in cuneiform. But writing seems to be so useful that it's evolved independently as far as we can tell. Again, the debate's ongoing at least 3 to 5 times, probably more, but we don't have the archaeological record for that. But you have cuneiform in about 3200 BCE, so 5,000 years ago. You have hieroglyphics about the same time, 5,000 years ago. Very, very different system. You have the Indus Valley writing, which has not been deciphered yet, so people are still confused about that. But that's about 4,500 years ago, give or take. You have the writing in China, which was on like the shoulder bones of oxen and turtle shells originally. And again, how well that was preserved, it's clear that it existed before we have the record of it. But so that's about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. You have the writing in China, which is, again, a very different approach to writing. And then in the New World, you have right around, say 3,000 years ago, right around 900 BCE, you have the writing in Mesoamerica. And so that's, depending on how you're scoring, because it is, did cuneiform influence hieroglyphics? Did the Indus Valley script, was it influenced by cuneiform or hieroglyphics? Did China have contact enough to pick up this idea? But probably those 5 are probably independent developments of writing, which suggests if something comes up over and over again, like the spearhead, like once you realize like spearhead, you're like, oh, that's a great idea. Well, other people look at it and go, it's nice, a stick with a sharp point on it so we don't have to get close to those wild animals. It's developed a bunch of times independently. So there wasn't one breakthrough. So writing is so useful and so powerful that it evolved at least those 5 times independently and survived. So this is another key notion. It wasn't just that it was developed, it's that it survived, and that is amazing. So modern Chinese today, is a direct descent. Cuneiform died out, hieroglyphics died out, but part of the sound was maintained. In a version of Greek that used was based on Egyptian speech and sound phonemes. So that's amazing. But today, Chinese still rolling, right? Like it's still going, unbroken line of, hey, let's use this language and just keep going with it, which is phenomenal when you think about it, because we're talking about now over 3,000, 4,000 years of continuous use and development over time. So it's hugely valuable in some way. And that's why it's developed and survived and kept developing and kept morphing and kept going. So this process conferred some sort of advantage, an advantage that allowed for the organization and the communication, again, crucially across time. And this is where, when I said the expansion of our ability to conceptualize time leads to something like this, where you go, oh, I'm going to want something in the future. Now, this is again, we take it so for granted that we forget that this had to evolve both culturally and evolutionarily for us to be able to have these kinds of thoughts and these concepts that we could also act on, where we can say, I'm going to do something today that puts into savings for use in a couple of years, but I need a record of that. And now, even a regular farmer who's not going to be literate, by the way, this is the farmers are going to be literate, the people in the field aren't going to be literate, but their minds have expanded and they live in a culture that allows them to be able to make use of that expansion and go, I get these tokens. Now I know this abstraction stands for this other thing over here, which will, over the course of time, which I can now conceptualize, will allow me to, undo that exchange or redo that exchange. And this is this sort of level of abstraction that writing in all of its many forms introduces is just extraordinary. And I think even today, even though we're just immersed in words, and particularly in writing, we don't appreciate how bizarre, what a strange notion this is, that abstract random scratchings on a paper, as long as we all agree about them, can send meaning across not just a year or 2 years or 5 years, but now we know across millennia. We can translate and read texts from 1,000 years ago, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which have passages that are hard to figure out what they're talking about, but they have passages that are just quite moving. And you go, oh, like we could have done okay in ancient Babylon. Like they were like us, and we know this, and that story and the relationships and the desires that are in there resonate across thousands and thousands of years. And that conceptualization it's new. It's brand new. So just as an example, to train a scribe would take years and years to train a scribe. And so they're being trained to learn a language that you have to assume is going to be around for years and years and years. So part of the agrarian process is the settlement process, because you need a settled area with a controlled population that are going to share enough habits and education of the scribal class and agreement across all of these elements of life that you can actually write in these abstract symbols and think that in 10 years someone will receive this abstract symbol and be able to decipher them. So now you're thinking in terms of a lot of people across larger spaces and across longer periods of time. Again, it's just this repeated expansion of our capacity for abstraction and our capacity to imagine, and for that imagination, again, to be made real. That I can take little clay tablets that are marked with a special mark and go to the temple and they'll give me food. I mean, and to believe that. See, no, this is the key. This is the key. And to believe that. And by the way, this is why today people talk about, like fiat money, I can't believe it's not backed by anything. I mean, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, we were using little clay balls with symbols on the outside to exchange. And people were exchanging them, by the way. This is very clear in the archaeological record that they worked out, 1 second later, like, oh, well, if I have a clay ball marked with, I get a bushel of wheat, I can trade that to my neighbor for a camel, because I need a camel for some reason, right? Like that sort of immediate use of those for bartering and exchange, and it becomes a kind of money, or at least a marker for future payments and all. Like it evolves immediately. And what is it backed by? It's backed by a figurine wrapped in clay with a stamp on the outside from the priests. Yeah, so nothing has changed. I mean, this is not a lot has changed in like whatever that is, 8,000 years. Shockingly, it sounds like such a new fiat money. Everybody's like, oh, fiat money is amazing. Either it's the worst thing they ever invented, or it's the greatest thing, or just this innovation. I'm like, no, we've invented fiat money like a million times, because it turns out like once you have the conceptual apparatus put into place, and you have a scribal class and you have writing, then it's all there. Then all of these other sort of permutations of possibility become available. And so fiction starts, mythopoetic fiction. It's clear that we had narrative tales, and it's clear that we had stories already, because this is the first thing that's being recorded. It's clear the Epic of Gilgamesh was an oral story that was being repeated and told. But now all of a sudden you get this idea of, the version, official stories. We want to write these down. We want to preserve them in their correct form, right? All of these ideas. And then, of course, you get, the king is a rotten guy. No, we don't want to write that, right? So then you start getting censorship. And like, what are those scribes writing over there? We need somebody who can read that as well. And all of the sort of education wars get kicked off, and we're off and running. And also the debate gets kicked off already, almost immediately, like, oh, well, these people are just parasites on society. They're not growing food. They're not producing anything. They're just sitting up in the temples, and then it's like, no, we need these people too. And so also this debate about, who's a parasite, who's making a real contribution, how you should distribute the benefits of what is a communal project. What's the best way to do that? So all of these debates that are raging right now today in modern societies all over the world, they get kicked off. And one of the prime elements, and it's not that writing causes this, it's that writing is associated with the mental capacities and social organizations that you have to have these debates. But when you get this capacity, and you get agriculture, and you get fixed populations that are able to grow and become cities, all just the full panoply of modern problems that we think of as being so contemporary, and like, oh, we're in this, who's paying the fair share, and what work should be rewarded, and how much should people be paid, and how do we distribute the goods, and tax systems, and all of this is there at the moment of birth, right? It doesn't it's the problem. I don't know if it's gotten more difficult, maybe slightly more complicated because technology and larger versions of this, but not functionally different. And this is one reason why the history of civilization, at least to me, and I think to many other commentators, is so fascinating, is because it is the history of the same problems recurrent for, okay, now we're looking at 5, 6, 7,000 years. You look at Uruk, you look at the problems that Gilgamesh was trying to face. You look at, the record. You look at the fact that it's very clear in the scribal record that scribes immediately realized that you could embezzle. Like they start cheating on the records, right? Oh, we can, if it's the token that lets you get the grain back, well, we can just make a few extra tokens over here on the side, right? And all this, it's all human all the time. But it is this this is why I want to do agriculture, cities, and literacy, reading and writing, because it's sort of a unit. They sort of come together. Now, you can have large population bases without writing. That's clearly happened in the in the archaeological record, and you can have pretty large population groupings, at least temporarily, without fully developed, cereal agriculture. You can have apparently some writing associated with not agriculture, but maybe nomadicism to a certain extent. So it's not that all of these have to be present all the time. It's that somehow when you get the three of them fused together, it just starts this flywheel that is the modern world that we recognize so immediately. And this is why I think it's one of the big differences between the way we look at history is we almost invariably look back at history along the channels of literacy and what we call civilization, which means the people that had writing in cities. And we do that because this is us, because this gives us a mirror to see us. And when you go away from there and you go like anthropology or, these sorts of fields where they go, oh, well, how about all the other people who didn't do that? And we're like, well, it's kind of weird. And they're out doing what we don't know. In fact, we're going to talk more about that next time when we talk about God, because this is very important, it just doesn't resonate the same way. It's interesting. It gives us insight in what's humanly possible, but it's those rivers of cities, be it in China or Mesoamerica or Uruk, Rome, Greece, these channels, Egypt, that resonate with us, even though these are wildly different societies, wildly different cultures, because once you get the city and the agrarian, the cereal agriculture and the writing, you get us. And so there's this massive transformation. And so as primates, we're now in this bizarre world. And this is where I, just pause a moment and reflect on this. We're in this bizarre world where our small territorial holdings have grown to extraordinary degrees. And I did look this up, by the way, and so the average Paris arrondissement is roughly 5 kilometers squared, which is, drum roll please, as I expected, roughly the size of a chimp territory in a dense forest. Now, this varies. If they're woodlands, they're larger. If they're highly dense, they can be smaller. But depending on the terrain, give 5 to 30 square kilometers or 20 square kilometers is about what chimp territories are. And if you look at the neighborhoods in cities and you look at arrondissement in Paris, if you look at how we conceptualize our space, hey presto, it's in about 5 kilometer units, which is, again, not that surprising because it's what we can walk easily. It's easy walking distance is basically one way to think about it. If it's an easy stroll, there we go. That makes sense. We can conceptualize it. We like it. And now we have this notion of the walkable city, which again is functionally like primates happy when walk everywhere, right? This is basically what the walkable city movement is trying to talk about, all kinds of other things, many of which are good and interesting. So I'm not in any way opposed to the walkable city. I love the idea of the walkable city. I live in a walkable city, but this is is just like primates. Primate good when can walk everywhere most of the time. Happy primate. So when we move into things like Uruk, the early city, it's talked about in the Epic of Gilgamesh, like how to design a city. It's right there in the epic, our earliest, sustained narrative work. One of the things is like, well, how do we do city things? How do we get people to live together in cities? Like, what's our relationship with the area outside of the city? What do we do with nature? Right? All these questions just come to the fore, and the answers look a lot like, how do we make this work for the fact that we're still chimps, but now we live in cities and we have writing. And writing, again, seems to be peculiarly important for evolving that capacity for abstraction, maybe to its maximum degree. Maybe there's more abstraction. Some people would add mathematics, but by the way, we're doing math from the get-go. Math is right there. As I mentioned last time, to do ag, you basically need math. And while the record keeping isn't of a mathematical nature, counting, area calculations, volume calculations, all these problems need to be solved. Because if you're building like round towers and storing grain, I mean, now you've got a cylinder problem with volume, cylinder volume problems, which are not, these are not easy by any stretch of the imagination, at least for people like myself. So all of that mental capacity comes to the fore and becomes emphasized, and you have societies that begin to select and cultivate for that. It becomes a valuable capacity within your culture to be able to do this. And it introduces, well, again, just all these new possibilities, one of which is sedition. Sedition and pornography seem to come almost immediately. Like, this is what people start writing. They like sexy stories, and they like to write bad things about the current rulers. And so this also feeds back into this control element that I talked about. How do we control the imaginations and the thinking patterns of these people that now have, some of them, at least the scribes, have the capacity to do this abstract symbol work that now we're just really getting out there. This is just getting crazy. But that evolution is slow, like really, really slow. Like when the Normans came into England, conquered England, the Norman yoke and all that, one of the things that they were fighting about, the Romans had this problem too, is the way land holding was held in much of the British Isles prior to the invasion of Rome and then the total invasion of the Normans was through public meetings, right? You just came in and you said, oh yeah, the 20 people that matter in the region all agree that this property from that rock to this rock is Ed's. This is Ed's property. Great. We all swear to that. We swear an oath. And then they tried to introduce paper, right? Then the bookkeepers show up. And again, this is, 3,000, 4,000 years after the advent of writing. It is not everywhere by any stretch of the imagination. And they're like, hey, you need, we don't care what you shaggy guys say. It's on this piece of paper. It says that this belongs to the Duke of where before. And everyone goes, well, what are you talking about? Like, we don't know that guy. We've never seen him. What's that piece of paper? We're not literate. And so, of course, now you're kicking off the lawyer wars, right? Like, wait a second, that's just cheating. We don't want to do lawyer wars. We all stand here and we all know this is the truth. And so then you get this, the tension already starts. Again, this is in the early writing. We already get this tension between the felt, lived, physical, known, primate experienced world and this land of abstraction, of abstract stories, of narratives, stories of gods and heroes and kings that we've never seen, and pieces of paper that tell us that this land has been no longer yours, it's somebody else, or it was somebody else's, and now it's yours. You can fast forward another 1,000 years, give or take, and now you Native Americans and in the New World, not just Native Americans, but all kinds of peoples in the New World discovered that hey, wait a second, what do you mean this piece of paper says that this is now the land of the King of England as opposed to ours? And so it took millennia for the evolution of writing and literacy to become even close to a norm. And so again, it's important to emphasize that all of the elements that we take for granted with writing are fresh from a civilization standpoint. We associate civilization with writing, which is accurate, and we should, because that's the kind of civilization we recognize. But most of the people, and by far, like early on, we're talking 99% of the people are illiterate. But by the time even you get to 1,000 years ago, probably 98% of the population is still illiterate on the planet. And then you get to 500 years ago, it's probably only in the last 100 years. I tried to work this out. I couldn't find really clear records on this, but it's what is clear is that most of the people, even 100 years ago, if they were literate on the planet, it was a very remote kind of literacy. It's not like I can sit down and read a novel or a newspaper. It's like, oh, I can maybe sign my name in a record book. And that's that recently. And so one of the things that we're experiencing that I think is also slightly unnerves us is the degree to which it has become absolutely predominant, like how overwhelmingly present the record, the writing, the written has become over the last century, over the last 2 centuries in everybody's life. Because before it used to be this rare thing. Oh, all the records were kept at the Catholic Church. That's where you were born, you got married, maybe you transferred some property. The Catholic Church has those records. And so we have records on people, and there's like 5 entries for their whole life. So imagine doing paperwork 5 times in your entire life. Right? Like there's your birth record, your, your marriage record, the birth of your children record, and something else, and, and your death record. So you don't have to do, 2 of them you didn't do. You don't do your death and your birth. Somebody else has to handle those. So, maybe your 3 or 4 pieces of paperwork or interaction with bureaucracy, maybe for your whole life. And it's just conceptually almost impossible to imagine. But what it masks is that somewhere behind all this was groups of scholars who were doing bunches and bunches more. And slowly the power and importance of that became like, oh, maybe everyone should be literate. It's a powerful thing. It's a valuable thing. It's something that should be shared with everyone. And again, what a strange notion, because it's clear that being educated has conferred historically very great benefits. And so it's been a long-running debate on whether those benefits should be shared or whether those benefits should be kept secret and held for the elect few. And generally over history, that latter argument has the one that's come to the fore. Like, you don't want everybody to be literate. You don't want the Bible put out in languages, for instance, that anybody can read. You want to keep it in Latin so that only the elect can read it and know what's going on, and they'll tell everybody else what's in there, right? That debate is going on. And by the way, that example from Catholic and medieval history of Europe, there are examples of this from all over the world. How many people should be literate, what literacy means, how they're allowed to use literacy has been debated since the evolution of literacy, because it raises all of these important questions. And if you have the primate instinct, which is, this is a communal good, and we need to come up with some means of distributing it, that tends to come to the fore. And then you get notions of, educate more people. And universal education, by the way, is a very, very recent development like that. It's so new that I'm still not sure we're convinced it's a good idea. And there's a lot of evidence that, people still don't really believe in it, by the way. It's just, French Revolution kind of got the idea going, and then people are like, I guess we have to do it. And now people are like, do we really want to do this? I mean, I think it's a great idea, but besides the merits of it, it's certainly not a set idea that everybody thinks that we should have universal education. Lots and lots of people think it's a waste of time. And it's certainly not present in much of the world today, unfortunately. So even that concept is so recent that it's not widely or universally accepted, not even close to universally accepted. That's how, still evolving this unbelievably powerful notion of being able to read and write is. So not a final note. I could go on and on about this, but for the primate view, one of the elements that this does that I think is many of these elements have been commented on, but I think one that is little commented on that I think is worth emphasizing is the capacity to write down one's own thoughts and compare them across time. And it's clear that writing allows for the cultivation of the individual. So speech is a shared program, immediately shared program. Most material goods until fairly recently were in some sort of communal, familial environment, right? Like this interweaving, which was necessary for the survival of societies. The fact that we generally used to live in much larger groups, even if we had a private house inside a city, that house would be might contain 10, 15, 20 people, many generations, like that sort of notion. And then you get this technology that allows you to reflect and write about yourself. So people think the memoir and all that is new. It's as a genre, it's modestly new, depending on, how you think about a few centuries as new. But it's clear that that capacity is absolutely central to the self-awareness of people. Like all of a sudden, I can keep a diary. I can write a private communication between myself and my brother or my sister or my girlfriend or my boyfriend or my wife or my husband or my children. I can leave a note for my children after I'm dead, right? Like I can pass that on. So all of a sudden, our own sense of ourselves becomes transformed. This ability to reflect. It's the opening scenes or not the opening scenes, but it's one of the key passages or sequence of passages in 1984 where the main character tries to keep a diary, tries to write down his own thoughts. And that capacity to sort of express and communicate with yourself that writing presents. So it not just expands our time externally, it expands our internal life. It increases the possibilities for self-reflection and self-understanding in a way that simply didn't exist before. And so, both the external world is transformed and the internal world is transformed. And we can communicate with other people across time. We can write a letter and send it as an ambassador to another king, which would be early version of this. And then, as this spreads, now people start sending letters all over the place. And, all of a sudden we're off and running now. It's being translated across distances. It's being translated across time. It's being literally translated across languages. And so all these skills and mindsets and outlooks begin to grow at the same time that the internal begins to be expanded. I can keep a diary and look back at what I was doing. I can reflect on myself over time. I can write down my imagination. And it's clear that early parts of fiction writing was people writing down their own imaginative thoughts and other people saying, oh, that was a cool thing. You should write more of those, right? You should do more externalizing of your internal imagination. So it becomes another outlet for the sort of aesthetic explosion that has already happened with the cave paintings and all that we've talked about, but in a very peculiar and direct way. And so it expands what it means or can mean to be human. And it makes this big leap from the primates who are, in the now, in the physical, in the moment, even though they do, again, have some capacity for the past and some capacity to examine the future. Wow, this massive layer of abstraction gets added. And how that abstraction, that capacity for abstraction can be used is, I'm still not sure we've figured it all out. I still think we're exploring and discovering and developing this. And it's so that is that extraordinary power once literacy is developed, where you get specialization, communication, internal reflection, a totally different sense of time, a capacity to think of communicating across much greater distances and even hearing back from those distances. At a year from now, I'll send an ambassador out. He's going to write stuff down. He'll send somebody back to me. And in 6 months, I'll get a message back about something. This is mind-blowing capacities. And yet, for all of that, it is still, literacy, again, is not a universal thing. It's not a universal expectation in much of the world still today. And the popularity of the oral form of communication, people love the human voice. It's the vocalization that goes all the way back. And so when I think of a podcast like this, I think of the popularity of podcasts. It's like, oh, once the technology allowed us to easily record and distribute the human voice, people were like, you know what we like? We like audiobooks. We like the human voice. We like stories narrated in this fashion, because that goes back, tens of thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And then the vocalizations of that go back even further. And we just love this. It's innate in us. So we have overwritten in the vocalization patterns and capacities of the primate this massive step into abstraction that transforms basically our capacity to interact with and understand the world and ourselves. And I think, like I said, we're still struggling with this. We still don't know. Do we trust writing? Is it true? Is what this person wrote true? Plato wrote about this in one of the Socratic dialogues, the Phaedrus, and other places, but primarily there in the Phaedrus, where Socrates is like, yeah, you just don't trust it. You want to trust. You want to see the person. You can't trust just words. You can't trust these abstract things on the page because they aren't concrete. And again, we still struggle with this. 5,000, 6,000 years after functionally sort of a vague version of fiat currency was developed, people are still freaked out about fiat currency because there's the physical, there needs to be something real there. But then we have the other thoughts like, no, my imagination is real, right? Or once you get the abstract capacities of art and language, your imagination certainly becomes much more real, becomes more palpable, more handleable. You can feel it so much more directly once you've developed these capacities. And that is the evolutionary step that you get that just transforms civilization as we understand it today. And last note here, and I think it's something that I'm experiencing directly because, again, I moved to France, so now I'm having to learn French as a new language. I mean, I knew a tiny bit of French before I arrived, but basically learning French as a new language. And you realize, or I'm realizing, that the amount of investment it takes to produce a literate person is extraordinary. It takes years and years of practice and training for a child to become a literate adult. And so I'm not saying it's all school years done on this, but it takes years. So you would need to study a couple hours, a day here or there, probably from the time you're 6 or 7 to the time you're, 15 or 20, to become really functionally, literate, be able to read and write correctly on your own, access books it is a massive investment, and it is a reflection of several things. One, the wealth of our society, that we can set aside so much time to take our children and young people and spend time with them so they can gather this literacy, and how valuable we generally recognize it to be. Like the capacity to be literate is so powerfully recognized as great that we do actually invest titanic sums of energy, time, and money to produce lots and lots of literate people. And that is a reflection of the power and of the influence of that worldview. Because, it's taken about, let's say if you say the earliest writing is from 5,000 years ago, it's taken 5,000 years for the general concept that we should all be literate, which is still controversial and still not put in action everywhere in the world, but generally to be seen as a good idea. So in some ways, we are not even done with the revolution of literacy yet, because we have yet to really settle in as a globe and say, let's get everybody literate. But we mostly have. We're mostly there, but we not quite cracked it. And I do think, interestingly, there is some evidence that people are backsliding on this. Like with the modern technology, with digital communications, people are like, what do we need this writing stuff for? What do we need this reading stuff for? Because it's hard, and it is hard. It is a difficult skill. As I mentioned, it takes a huge amount of time to master these skills. But for that level of abstraction, self-understanding, global understanding, and communication to be achieved, it is necessary. And so, yeah, even though 5,000 years later, we're still struggling with it, it's worth struggling with. And I think if nothing else tells you the power and importance of literacy and of its development and centrality to the way we understand civilizations and living in the world, it is this leap. It is this leap from the primates who could vocalize and communicate in a small group to the capacity to communicate across time and space with this phenomenal development of abstraction that in many ways liberates our minds and our imaginations in ways that it never was possible before. To the point that 5,000 years later, we're still trying to understand it, still trying to incorporate it, and still trying to make it work for our limited capacity as primates to deal with the thing that we've evolved and developed to help us deal with the world that we keep evolving and developing within. So, literacy, thank you very much.